All right, it is 6 o'clock. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight. We started a little bit earlier than we anticipated, just on a setting issue. So thanks for holding tight until 6. And joining us for this August preservation conversation, Dr. Guy Lancaster, presenting the 1892 lynching of Henry James in Little Rock. I'm Patricia Blick, Executive Director of the QQA, and I'm joined by Shelley Stormo, our Membership and Events Coordinator. I would like to thank our donors as well as our corporate and individual members. We are able to continue our educational programs with your support. You can find a list of our corporate members on our website at quapaw.com. If you're not a member of the QQA and you believe in our mission, preserving Greater Little Rock's historic places, we invite you to join and support the work we do. Please go to quapaw.com to join for as little as $35 per year or to make a donation. If you join or donate at the $100 level, you'll receive our Never, Never, Never Give Up t-shirt. Before I introduce our speaker, I wanted to let you know that we will be taking your questions at the end of the talk. Please type your questions in the chat area of Zoom. We are also sharing this program on YouTube, so you can enter your questions in the comment section. On to tonight's preservation conversation. I'm very pleased to introduce tonight's speaker, Guy Lancaster. Guy Lancaster holds a Ph.D. in Heritage Studies from Arkansas State University and is the author, co-author, or editor of several books on racial violence in Arkansas. He currently serves as the editor of the Online Encyclopedia of Arkansas, a project of the Central Arkansas Library System. The lynching of Henry James, the subject of his lecture tonight, is covered extensively in his 2018 anthology, Bullets and Fire, Lynching and Authority in Arkansas, 1840 to 1950, as well as his latest book, American Atrocity, The Types of Violence in Lynching, which is now available for pre-order from the University of Arkansas Press. Please join me in welcoming Guy Lancaster, Ph.D.
All right. Thank you, Patricia. Thank you, Shelley, for having me. I get a little weird when people introduce me as Dr. Guy Lancaster, PhD. When I graduated with my doctorate, passed my exams, and my dissertation was approved, and I called my grandmother to let her know. She said, "When I told you I wanted a doctor in the family, I meant an MD, someone who earned some money. PhD."
Oh my.
She said, PhD just stands for poor, hungry doctor.
Oh, I don't think so. Well, I'm going to turn this over to you, but I'm just going to let you know that we rely heavily upon the work that you do, not only your research, but management of the encyclopedia, Arkansas Encyclopedia Online. So you may not be, as my mom would say, a medical doctor, but you are a doctor who helps us extensively. So thank you for joining us. And I'm sure your grandmother is very proud of you, nonetheless.
Yeah. Okay. I'll get started here. I'm Guy Lancaster, as has been said, and I know we're all hoping to meet in person, but the pandemic has not abated. I find I do miss going to places, going to events like lectures like this, and eating little squares of cheese and drinking other people's boxed wine. And I hope to do that again soon. So if you can help make that possible by getting yourself vaccinated, if you're not already. Before I begin tonight's talk, I didn't prepare any pictures. I was preparing to do this in person, so I didn't prepare a slideshow, and we don't have any pictures of this particular event, none that I'm aware of, and I'm a little, I question using pictures of lynchings in public presentations like this for a broad audience for a number of reasons. They have tremendous academic value, but at the same time, we kind of have to be aware that many of these victims, the only time they were ever pictured, the only time they ever had their pictures taken was when they were dead, and usually hanged in a very degrading position. So I'm just preparing a straight talk. I hope you don't mind that. But I hope it will be interesting for you. So I'm going to get to it. The Arkansas Gazette on May 15, 1892, rendered the following verdict about the events of the previous day in Little Rock. Quote, "In the South, it is the unwritten law that the man who commits the most atrocious of crimes of which a woman can be made the victim will die. It was in obedience to this inexorable law that the monster Henry James, the Negro who so fiendishly assaulted little Maggie Doxey, was hanged to a telephone pole early Saturday morning by an infuriated mob and riddled with bullets. Despite acknowledging that the courts were perfectly capable of dealing with the crime in question and that James would no doubt have been hanged, the editorial writer insisted there were times, quote, when human passion becomes a law unto itself, when a higher law discards all legal forms." Henry James, described in the various accounts as a 22-year-old, quote, mulatto, was lynched for the reported crime of raping 5-year-old Maggie Doxey on Tuesday, May 10th of 1892. Doxey was the adopted daughter of Charles R. Johnson, a former night clerk at the Capitol Hotel, who lived at the corner of 19th Street and Gaines, and his wife, and they lived together with her mother, one Mrs. Pennington. James later told police that he originally hailed from Augusta, Missouri, and had been working for several months as a waiter in a hot springs hotel, or according to a later report, Gleason's Hotel in Little Rock, but that he had been employed by the Johnsons as a general utility man for about 2 weeks prior to this incident. According to the Gazette, Charles Johnson had been away in Hot Springs on business for a few weeks, with his wife joining him there on Sunday, May 8th. While Mrs. Pennington was in the front room of the house, preoccupied with writing a letter that Tuesday morning, around 8 a.m., Henry James and Maggie Doxey were in the kitchen. It was there that he reportedly raped her, muffling her to avoid attracting attention, then threatening her with death in order to keep her quiet until he could flee the scene. Mrs. Pennington later learned of what happened and sent a telegram to Mrs. Johnson, who returned by the afternoon train and subsequently alerted Mayor Henry Louis Fletcher, who put detectives on the case. Meanwhile, a Dr. GMD Cantrell was called in to examine Doxey and found her injuries to be serious. According to the story as presented in the newspaper, James eluded capture until detectives employed a ruse, letting it be known abroad that if James would but return to the Johnson household, the family would re-employ him. The ruse reportedly worked, and James returned to the Johnson home at around 8 a.m. on May 13, where he was seized by Detective Dave Adams and Mike Egan and immediately conveyed to jail. The mayor, however, fearing mob action against James and not wanting his own jail torn down, ordered the prisoners transferred to the county jail. But at least the mayor was still in town. The Gazette reporter managed to interview Deputy Sheriff Jesse Hurd after he just locked James up in a secure cell on the second floor of the county jail, and the deputy acknowledged that Sheriff Anderson Mills and Chief Deputy Sheriff Horace Booker were both absent, leaving him in charge of a situation rapidly spiraling out of control. In fact, the deputy had just received word that, quote, a mob of 1,000 men would attempt to lynch James tonight. The Gazette published 2 articles on the May 13 lynching of James, the second of which picks up after James had been murdered, and which was written in a decidedly dramatic fashion, opening with midnight. It is the hour when graveyards yawn and hell breathes contagion to the world. It was about the hour when Henry James' guilty soul took its flight from his polluted body. As the story goes, a mob did arrive at the county jail and managed to discover that James was nowhere inside, having been transferred yet again, this time to the state penitentiary. The majority of the mob quietly returned to their homes, while some few wandered over to the state pen to see if they could discover James being concealed there. At the prison, the mob accosted the driver of a hack, believing it had likely just transferred James over. Colonel S.M. Apperson, described as secretary and manager of the lessees at the prison, met the crowd around 11 p.m. Apperson acknowledged that James was present and stated that he would remain there until 8 o'clock the following morning, at which point he would be handed back to the sheriff. At this, the story continues, the crowd appointed a committee to wait until this morning and see that their man was not spirited away. But about the time that the committee had been decided upon, the word had been sent back to town that the fiend had been located at the penitentiary, had begun to work, and reinforcements were arriving by the dozen. As the mob grew, various people took turns giving speeches, riling up the mass of folk for what would come. Apperson refused again and again to hand his prisoner over and reminded the mob that breaking into the penitentiary would constitute a crime. But he appeared to throw a bone their way when he reminded them that the prisoner was scheduled to be handed over to the sheriff in the morning, quote, and then they could get him. A proposal was raised among the mob to go to the sheriff directly, suggesting that perhaps they knew where he was, and warn him that the penitentiary was in danger of being attacked. But the mob quickly took up the cry of break down the gates. A man named Pangburn, quote, a physical giant who was formerly on the police force, battered at the gates with a sledgehammer, bringing them down with a few blows at approximately 12:15 a.m. The mob rushed in, and a committee of 6 went in search of the condemned man, including 3 who had volunteered to identify James. However, the excitement was contagious, and the entire mob swarmed into the jail. It took them 30 minutes to break into the cell house, but they found Henry James in the very first cell. After he was dragged outside, some of the mob began yelling for rope, but an apparent leader cried out, "No rope yet. We want to try and convict him. We want to be sure." As the historian Amy Louise Wood observes, many lynchings followed the pattern of public executions, which often included public admission of the crime committed by the condemned. As she says, these testimonials ensured that the condemned understood his crime and punishment, and understanding that was necessary to ratify the execution as divinely sanctioned. Confessions lent lynchings the trappings of lawful punishment and served to justify the mob's violence as rightful and warranted, despite that confessions were forced and were often obtained after the lynching was underway and not likely to be aborted. Apparently, in the interest of providing a quasi-judicial ritual, the mob marched Henry James through the streets of Little Rock and over to the home of his alleged victim. However, what happened fell far short of any kind of trial. Instead, Charles Johnson, who by this point had returned to Little Rock, was alerted by couriers that the mob was bringing James over to his residence. He met the mass of people outside, and upon spying his former handyman, cried out, "That is the man." The mob decided that this was enough and determined to string up James, though debate ensued as to the best place for such a deed. Quote, but after consultation, it was decided to take the culprit to the corner of Main and Markham Streets or to the State House yard, and there mete out the swift and terrible punishment he had brought upon himself. At the corner of 18th Street, someone spied a tree half a block west, quote, where the mob turned in to wreak their vengeance there, but the tree was not available. This goes unexplained. Perhaps it was not easily accessible, or its owner balked at the idea of so many people being on his property, but I've often wondered about that statement, the tree was not available. So the march continued through the city, the mob going as it traveled until it numbered about some 500 people, not one of whom made any effort to conceal his features, as the Gazette reported. At the corner of 5th and Main, where there stood Citizens Bank and a proper telegraph pole, the mob stopped, now apparently less boisterous and more focused upon carrying out the deed at hand. One person prepared a rope on the pole, and James was presented with a chance to confess his alleged crimes. However, James refused to cooperate for a long time, and apparently while waiting on him, the mob again decided to change the location of his execution to the corner upon which the Pythian Hall stood. There they slung a rope over a telephone pole before he arrived. James finally said to the mob, "I guess I am guilty," and was urged to confess by a friend of the prisoner who was perhaps not satisfied with the less than total admission James had provided. After being allowed to spend some time in prayer, James was conveyed to his place of execution. The noose was placed around his neck and he was soon swinging. Before he had even been raised above the heads of the assembled crowd, someone fired a shot into James and a fusillade of bullets, estimated at more than 100, tore into his body. Loose shots destroyed some of the windows in the Pythian Hall, leading the Gazette reporter to comment without the slightest trace of irony whatsoever, quote, "It was almost miraculous that someone was not hurt in this miscellaneous fusillade." Governor James Philip Eagle and his wife Mary were just returning to Little Rock from a trip to Memphis, Tennessee, and were on a streetcar then nearing the corner of 5th and Main. The governor, seeing the large crowd, was informed that a lynching was taking place, and so jumped off the streetcar just as the shooting began. He managed to take hold of the man who fired the last shot, dragging him 30 or 40 yards back to Main Street before the mob rushed upon him and freed his solitary prisoner. The governor was knocked about a bit and succeeded in punching one person during the struggle. Mary Eagle was escorted to a doorway along the road, and after her husband joined her, they hailed a carriage and were driven home. The Gazette described this rough treatment of the governor, again without irony, as, quote, "an indignity that every man will resent and for which the perpetrator should be severely punished." The body of Henry James was left hanging at press time, 4:00 a.m., though the newspaper indicated that it was to be cut down later that day. Meanwhile, thousands of people reportedly visited the corner, where they exchanged their opinions about the work of the mob, nearly everyone justifying what had been done. The lynching was reportedly the all-absorbing topic of conversation in the city the following day, as groups of spectators, having heard through the columns of the Gazette of the lynching, came to see the victim before he should be cut down. According to the Gazette reporting, some Black visitors to the spot expressed approval of what had occurred. The idea that members of the more respectable Black community express approval of the mob's actions is a trope present in many lynching reports. However, there are also reports of, quote, incendiary speeches given by some groups of lawless African Americans, while the Democrat newspaper reportedly received a letter warning people that 25 Black men had sent to Chicago to purchase dynamite for purposes of blowing up some large assembly of white people. A threat that the Gazette labeled senseless, given that, quote, "such a course would result in the speedy extermination of the colored race in this city." A photographer, given only the name of Davy, showed up around 6:00 a.m. to start taking photographs of the body. However, the early morning weather turned stormy at around 7:00, and the body of James was tossed about in the wind, and Davies himself was forced to seek shelter momentarily. The coroner arrived around 8:15 a.m., at which time James was finally cut down for conveyance to the undertaker, and from there to the Potter's Field of Oakland Cemetery. Meanwhile, as was common with regard to lynchings across the United States, members of the public began to take souvenirs from the night's event, starting with the rope, which was described in the newspaper as 1¼ inches in diameter and 125 feet long. Quote, "Within 20 minutes, the last vestige of the rope disappeared, and no evidences of the exciting scenes of the night before were to be seen after 9:00, though the street was haunted by the numerous morbidly curious people who seemed irresistibly drawn to the spot." Someone even carved the name Henry James onto the telephone pole where he was executed. The day after issue of the newspaper contained some information from eyewitnesses to the mob activity. The coroner summoned a jury and began taking statements. One W.G. Noble, who resided at 10th and Main, claimed to have heard Henry James confess to the crime in the company of 2 Black men whom the witnesses understood to be preachers. The second witness was Julius Mackey, who worked at the Gleason Hotel on West Markham. According to him, James was never accompanied by any friends or preachers. The inquest was concluded with the determination so common in lynching cases that James met his death, quote, at the hands of some person or persons to the jury unknown. The Gazette also included a clarification from one Dr. G.W. Hudspeth, mentioned in previous reporting as one of the men who volunteered to identify James. Hudspeth insisted that while he'd been at the county jail, he was not at the penitentiary and did not take part in the mob activity later in the evening. Reportedly, a handful of people attended the lynching, dressed as if for some society occasion, including, quote, a ladylike little woman who occupied a seat in a carriage on one of the corners of 5th and Main, as well as, quote, quite a number of gentlemen in full evening dress who hovered on the outskirts of the crowd. Finally, the Gazette reported upon the condition of Governor Eagle, who was said to have suffered a dislocated thumb on his left hand, but was otherwise unaffected by the rough treatment at the hands of the mob. He was reported to have said that even if he had been unable to prevent the violence, he would at least have, quote, attempted, if the mob would hang the Negro, not to have it done on the principal street of the capital city. National newspapers picked up on the story of the lynching of Henry James, adding their own details about the matter. The Wichita Daily Eagle, for one, reported on May 15th that, quote, an indignation meeting was held by the more vicious and lawless elements of the Negroes tonight. The better class, however, agree with the whites that only justice was meted out. Various national newspapers reported that same day that Maggie Doxey had died of her injuries just 1 hour after the hanging of James. But the Arkansas Democrat reported upon such a rumor being spread locally and checked in with the coroner, who was able to confirm the rumor was unfounded. Meanwhile, an African-American newspaper, the Appeal of St. Paul, Minnesota, used the lynching of James to interrogate the broader system of white supremacy in the United States, asking such questions as, quote, does any fair-minded person suppose there was any actual desire on the part of the authorities to prevent the mob at Little Rock, Arkansas, from breaking into the penitentiary and taking therefrom Henry James, the Afro-American accused of outraging the little white girl last week? The guards in that penitentiary could have kept a mob of 10,000 at bay for an indefinite period. Does any fair-minded person believe that had Henry James been white and Maggie Doxey black, and the circumstances otherwise exactly the same, that there would have been any such exhibition in the defense of outraged virtue by the, quote, superior race? Would a black Maggie Doxey at 5 years of age been any less pure than a white one? Would an assault on a black virgin 5 years old by a lecherous white brute been any less aggravating than if the colors were reversed? Did anybody ever hear of a white mob lynching a white man for outraging a black virgin? Why cannot a black man be tried in the legal courts? If there is any doubt of his innocence, he will get the benefit of the doubt. Would it not be following the first law of nature if the constantly outraged Afro-Americans take lex talionis, that is the Latin for eye for an eye, as their motto all over the South and act in accordance with the motto? If an insurrection 1,000-fold greater than the Nat Turner insurrection should break out in the South, who would be to blame? The Gazette writer tried to offer some justification for the murder of James by noting that while conviction for the crime of rape comes with a sentence of death, the, quote, victim is of an age upon which the crime of rape, the statutes of Arkansas declare, is impossible to be committed. However, Deputy Hurd had previously said in expressing his determination to protect James from the mob, quote, I am going to pull the lever that hangs James myself. So apparently he believed that this crime would entail the legal punishment of death. In fact, it appears that the Gazette's claim that James could escape death due to the youth of his victim was, at best, misinformed. The 1874 Arkansas Supreme Court case of Dawson v. State confirmed that someone could be tried for the crime of rape even if the victim had not yet reached puberty. In 1887, the court similarly ruled in Coates v. State that carnal knowledge of a girl under 12 years of age, quote, if against her will, or she is incapable from her tender years or want of mental and physical development of exercising a will with reference to the act, it is rape and the punishment is death. So what are we to make of all of this? On the one hand, we actually have a lot of information about this particular event. I've dug into multiple lynchings across the state, and some of these events, they targeted transients who were passing through a rural community. We don't have the names of the victims, and the sequence of events presented is vague at best. In contrast, we actually have a lot of information about this particular affair. We have the name of the victim and the names of those people who accused him of wrongdoing, and we know a little bit about their position in society. Thanks to the apparent eyewitness reporting of local newspapers, we can actually follow the mob as it wanders the city streets looking for a site perfect for lynching. There is enough factual material here that should someone be so motivated, one could do a deeper dive into it and perhaps uncover more information than I've presented here today. And I do hope someone will do that. However, we also have an amazing lack of information at the same time. We don't have the names of any members of the mob. That's often typical of reports of such events. We also lack enough information to judge whether or not Henry James actually committed the crime of which he is accused. There are many nowadays who believe that discussing the alleged crimes that at least served as a pretext for lynching does a disservice to the victims, given that they are not here to defend themselves and given that they were never properly tried and sentenced for these crimes. And so juridically they are innocent. And it should go without saying that even assuming he did in fact do it, Henry James' crime does not legitimate the mob's murder. However, avoiding any discussion of the alleged precipitating event can tend to undercut the humanity of the people whose actions set all of this in motion. I want to draw from another example. Newspapers reported that sharecropper Henry Lowry appeared at the house of his employer, O.T. Craig, in Mississippi County on Christmas Day of 1920, drunk and demanding a settlement for his crop. Craig reportedly attacked him, and as Lowry was leaving the house, one of Craig's sons shot at him, leading Lowry to return fire, killing Craig and his daughter and wounding his two sons. After this, he fled to Texas, but was later apprehended and returned to Arkansas, where a mob seized him and slowly roasted him to death. We can ignore the violence that fills this story and render Lowry a fairly innocuous figure who was brutally murdered outside the judicial process, or we can acknowledge his own apparent capacity for violence and start to see the greater system of exploitation in which his acts took place. As the historian Carlos Hill notes, quote, within the plantation economy, asking for a payment settlement was considered a subversive act that directly threatened the facade of debt upon which sharecropping was premised. It would have taken extreme nerve to challenge the system. And while African Americans were routinely depicted as drunk in media reports so as to disparage them, we can well imagine someone like Lowry maybe needing a drink or two to steel himself in order to confront the plantation owner, his employer, about finally settling up regarding the crop he brought in. And even then, his reports are clear, he did not initiate the gunfire, but only returned fire as he was attempting to leave. So if we insist upon ignoring these acts, then we lose some of the humanity of Henry Lowry, who likely did do what the newspapers described because he was a proud Black man living in a system of Southern oppression. It does not diminish Lowry's humanity to imagine that he perpetrated these acts. However, as we examine the precipitating event and the particular case of Henry James, we confront a cloud of uncertainty. Three possibilities stand before us. First, that Henry James did sexually assault Maggie Doxey. There's very little to argue for this aside from the fact that he was lynched for it. though there is presented in the newspaper reports testimony of certain doctors as to Maggie's injuries. But if he did flee after assaulting the young girl, why did he return to the household? Why did he not recognize that the family's purported desire to employ him again was a trap? The second possibility is that Maggie Doxey invented this story or said something that was misunderstood by the adults in her life. And I want to draw from another example here. Following the June 1894 lynching of one Henry Kappas in Columbia County for the alleged crime of attempting to enter the bedrooms of different young white women, another young African-American man was arrested for the attempted rape of a 4-year-old white girl who had reportedly informed her mother of the deed. As the Gazette reported, quote, "The child bears no marks of violence, though there is no doubt that she has spoken truthfully." So one is tempted here to wonder if this child's story were judged true only because it played into the pre-existing prejudices of those adults around her. We know that at such a young age, children are still navigating the differences between reality and fantasy and might be likely to repeat things that they hear. And so interrogating children who might have been the victims of trauma requires special care. However, it is very doubtful that the men and women predisposed to believe all Black men rapists would have taken great care in helping such a young girl come to the truth of what may or may not have happened to her. Finally, there's the possibility that for whatever reason, the family concocted this story as a means of eliminating Henry James. Again, there's nothing to indicate that occurring in this particular case, but we do see such occurring among other lynching accounts. For example, Clyde Ellison was lynched in Star City in 1919 for allegedly assaulting the daughter of a local farmer, at least according to those state newspapers that reported on the affair. However, one Colorado paper dug deeper into the matter and reported that Ellison had actually been lynched for refusing to work for a pittance on the plantation of David Bennett, who invented the story of Ellison's supposed assault upon his daughter as a means of frightening the man into working. We will never likely know just how many other mob murders were the result of similar conspiracies. So in the end, we don't actually know that much about the lynching of Henry James. But one thing that we can be sure of is the nature of any society that could turn such uncertainty into an exercise of deadly spectacle violence. This was a society completely unconcerned with any semblance of the truth. This was a society eager to exercise its brutal power for whatever reason it found fit. And with that, I will happily take any questions any of you might have.
Well, thank you very much, Guy, for that quite compelling presentation. And so we will open up the chat in YouTube, and I will, let me see if I can manipulate this, Shelley, so we can have a gallery view of us here and share our questions with our speaker. Hold on just a second there. All right. I don't know if you can see the questions up there also, Guy. We have one.
Yes.
From Kwame Abdul Bay.
Yeah, right.
Yes.
I can see that. So.
Oh, okay. I'll let you address it.
Okay. He asked, Arkansas Peace and Justice Memorial Movement, Pulaski County Remembrance Project is working to erect a marker on the site of the Henry James lynching. Have I been able to find any descendants? I've not yet. Part of the problem is the name Henry James is a very, very common name. You know, he's very difficult to locate. I know that the individuals who have put together the CSD lynching database, Stuart Tolney and Amy Kate Bailey, two sociologists who've been attempting to identify all lynching victims. They've not had a whole lot of luck either. You know, I know many historians have fantasies about the records that they could recover from time. Many people have ideas of discovering lost gospels or new Dead Sea Scrolls or some fantastic ancient source material. I would kill to have the 1890 census enumeration sheets. Those burned up in a fire, and we have very little of it left. The absence of the 1890 census enumeration sheets, it just kills me. That would be so helpful for helping to identify many of these victims, because the 1890s that was the peak period of lynching in the United States and in Arkansas too. So no, I've not been able to find any descendants, and I don't know if he would have any direct descendants. There are no reports of him being married or partnered in any way, and he was only 22 years old at the time he was killed. And like I say, the name Henry James is common enough to make it very challenging. But so more digging needs to be done in that.
There we go. I was on mute. We had a question from Jay Barth, Dr. Barth, asking, what was Governor Eagle's record on lynching, and was he fairly typical or atypical for that era?
I think it's very telling. He speaks to, when he talks to the Gazette, it's mostly about he's worried about this happening on the main thoroughfare, the intersection of what's now Capitol and Main Street, in Little Rock. That's his chief concern. Governor Eagle was not a man very much concerned with racial equality in any way. I mean, just the previous year, he signed into law the election law of 1891, which worked to disfranchise, African Americans. He was decidedly anti-populist. The populist party and various third-party movements allied with African Americans, and he was a revanchist Democrat. 1892 is the year the poll tax is instituted, also under his watch. No, I think his intervention in this case has to do with the fact that this lynching was occurring at such a public thoroughfare.
That comment was quite interesting. Another comment and question from Robert Richards. Thank you for this powerful presentation, Dr. Lancaster. Would you be willing to comment on the aspects of ritual in Henry James lynching and any of those ritual aspects that you think are particularly noteworthy?
There's been a lot of writing about ritual in lynching. Usually the procession of the mob to a particular area with significance. When the mob captured Henry Lowry, whom I mentioned, they captured him, on a train as it was either Mississippi or Memphis, where they took him from authorities who were transporting him back to Little Rock, or had intended to transport him to Little Rock, but they took a roundabout way to bring him back to northeastern Arkansas. And so the mob took Lowry to a spot near the plantation of O.T. Craig. So location is often a very important part of the mob's activities. I'm not quite sure what to make of the sort of peripatetic maneuvers of the mob in this case. they're often wandering about downtown, and I don't think it's any accident they end up at Fifth and Main, because that was, like a main thoroughfare. They lynching him somewhere very public. The taking of souvenirs is very common. Rope is often, if they hang him, rope is often cut up into small bits and distributed to members of the mob. Also in 1892, earlier in the year, talking about Governor Eagle's record, because he's fairly silent on this, a man named Ed Coy was lynched in Texarkana in front of a mob of about 5,000 or so. And he was tied to a cedar stake and a large cedar post and burned to death, burned alive. So after his execution, there's a tiny report in the Arkansas Gazette that says, this is several days later, says the cedar stump to which Ed Coy was burned is being turned into cufflinks. That someone took that wood and was manufacturing cufflinks out of it. We know that the mob also regularly took body parts from lynching victims. There's no evidence of that here, but there's evidence of it in other lynchings that occurred in Arkansas and in the nation. So those are all very, that's part of the ritual. It's not usually, studied in the same way, but there's also ritual in the absence of authorities. Any number of these, the local police chief, local sheriff, deputy sheriff, all absent themselves from the scene, often without any explanation or claim. There are a few. I think it's in there's a lynching in Clarendon, where the sheriff goes home with a stomach ache. That often there's sort of a ritual absenting of authority figures, and you see that here. No explanation why the sheriff and deputy sheriff are suddenly gone, but you see another aspect of ritual that pertains to authorities: the mob going to a jail and overpowering the jailer, or employing some ruse. They're in disguise and say, "Oh, we have another prisoner, let us in." And then once they're in, they take the keys from the jailer and tie up the jailer or lock him up or somehow. And you have to wonder, exactly, is this just creating plausible deniability for the jailer? Do they really put up a struggle? Do they really not know who is coming there? Do they not imagine that, hey, I have this man who reportedly committed this heinous crime and there are rumors of a lynching. Here are some people I know who don't, who claim to have a prisoner. I mean, surely you can't trust that. I have to say, this strikes me as, a ritual to create plausible deniability. That's sort of a long rambling answer, but yes.
Well, I mean, it's interesting too, when they're very clear about when this transfer is going to take place, right? I mean, that's right. Does that happen frequently? Kwame had a couple of other questions, but he also commented when you were responding, this absence of officials is eerily similar to the John Carter lynching in 1927.
And there are reports that, the cops were playing poker in the basement of the police station, there. So.
He also just questioned, you mentioned the 1890 census being missing and how helpful such would be for research into this pretty active lynching era in Arkansas. What is the most active year in Arkansas with the most documented lynchings between January 1st and December 31st?
I should have prepared. I should have known that someone would ask that. I think the early 90s, 1890s are very active. 1890, 1892, I'm looking at, and here, I'll share my screen here so everyone can see what I'm seeing. But the Encyclopedia of Arkansas, we have, of course, we have an entry on lynching, but it contains a chart here where we document lynchings, and we're constantly updating this chart. And you see we have links to separate entries. So like this is the first lynching that occurred in Arkansas, and we have a separate entry on that. But if we scroll down, we see 1891 is a fairly active year, especially because there's a mass lynching in Lee County relating to a cotton pickers strike. But scroll down, and 1892 is also very active, but 1891 more active than 1892. I'm going to say 1891 just because of that mass lynching there. But as you can see, it picks up again, more at the end of the decade too. But 1891 appears to be the most active year in the state.
When we were getting ready for this talk, Shelley and I were just pulling our information together and really didn't have an understanding of how this became a special area of study for you. Was it what you worked on for your dissertation, or was it something just by the nature of the work you're doing for the Encyclopedia of Arkansas that you found interesting and there wasn't very good documentation to share, or we didn't really know what led you to this field?
Well, my dissertation was on racial cleansing in Arkansas. So the expulsion of African Americans from certain communities, creating communities that are often called sundown towns. And in the era before digitized newspapers and easily, before it was very easy to find what you were looking for, I would have from census records say, a town had 24 African Americans in 1900 and none in 1910. So something happened during that time period. And the method of research was to go to the History Commission, load up a spool of the local newspaper and crank through 10 years, hoping I didn't miss whatever happened. So, I did a lot of cranking through 10 years of newspapers and really hated daily newspapers, love weekly newspapers from the period. But anyhow, while I was trying to find what happened, with these sundown towns, I would encounter, because a lot of the violence happened during the same time period. So I would see these lynching reports, nearly every week, every few weeks or so, and began thinking, I'm studying the wrong thing. I mean, not to make light of it, but the lynching was much easier to find. I didn't really intend to, go from sundown towns into lynching, but doing research on sundown towns, people would start, if they found newspaper articles relating to any sort of racial violence, and pass those along to me. So I just sort of ended up accumulating information on lynching. And of course, a number of other scholars have done research in Arkansas, like Richard Buckaloo wrote a dissertation on lynching in 1999. So after doing the book on sundown towns, I reached out to quite a few others, and we put together this anthology, Bullets and Fire. And I mean, of course, any research, once you publish some, like I say, it snowballs, and it's it feels, I guess I looked into this being a very timely thing to do. There's a lot more interest in this now. So I think this research is having a broader impact, and I'm trying to encourage other scholars to dig into this. And the national press for uncovering these stories, especially, is promoted by Equal Justice Initiative and its various affiliate organizations. People are very interested in this and are doing a lot of their own, more local research, and publishing and presenting research makes it easier to do more research. I mean, that sounds kind of duh, but what I mean is, once you start seeing some models of this history, some models of the behavior of the time period, you have a better idea of what to look for and what categories to put things in. So there is kind of a snowball effect.
Well, it's very interesting, and it's important to do it. And I can see for a long time it would have been avoided, and like a lot of our difficult history. So we appreciate you coming in and presenting tonight. Kwame also made a comment about microfiche. How much time did you spend playing with those old floppy microfiche films? Those were quite a pain as well, maybe more so than the reels. But I don't know if Shelley has any questions coming through on YouTube as well. No. Okay. All right. Well, I will go ahead and start sharing my screen again. If anybody has any other questions, feel free to put them in the chat. But I think we want to say thank you very much again,
well,
Dr. Lancaster. And we appreciate it and look forward to really understanding more of the research you've done and the implications.
And as I, as was mentioned, my new book, and I'll put it here in the chat, a link in the chat. This is a very rare, affordable academic book currently on sale at 25% off, or $14.96 96 cents if you pre-order from University of Arkansas Press. But I do want to talk about that because it's or just direct people to that, because it's kind of a thematic summation of a lot of what I've dug into, and kind of my attempt to really form a theoretical framework for understanding lynching in Arkansas and beyond. Well,
we need to, I need you to re-put that in the chat. I think it only went to the panelists and us, Shelley and myself. So I tried to copy it and paste it down there. I didn't have any luck. And then Kwame just said, thank you, Dr. Lancaster. Your work is extremely helpful to the work of the Arkansas Peace and Justice Memorial Movement. Kwame, Clarice, and Lauren.
Thank you.
Lovely.
Clarice and Lauren.
Uh-oh. There's an inside joke there, right?
Yeah.
Oh, good. Thank you. Shelley was able to copy it and share it as well. So very good. Well, again, thank you very much. We appreciate you, your willingness to come and present with us today. I'm sorry, as we all are, that we couldn't do it in person. It just didn't seem like it was, we're just not quite there yet. So,
and I appreciate you playing it safe. So
yeah. We're negotiating a lot of these challenging events that we're trying to put on, for sure. All right. So before I let you all off the hook here, I just want to mention our next preservation conversation is going to be on Thursday, the September 9th. Paul Parnell will present on the Rose Law Firm, 200 Years of History. And I've actually seen him give a very brief presentation on this, and it should be very interesting. And another thing I wanted to mention, of course, is that speaking of other events that we're preparing for, we are getting ready to hold our City Garden Beer and Ice Cream Family Social. It will be an outdoor event on the grounds of Curran Hall on Sunday, August the 29th from 4 to 7 p.m. You can get tickets in advance for $25 for attendees who are 21 and over, and $15 for attendees 21 years of age, under 21 years of age. And we will be serving George Brothers Ale, a special brew from Stone Stir Brewing. And we will also have a special ice cream flavor from Loblolly Creamery. So we're very excited about this. And you can get your tickets at quapaw.com. We'll have live music, root beer, lemonade, as well as popcorn and some children's activities. So again, thank you all very much for joining us tonight. Thank you again, Dr. Lancaster, for your very illuminating, painful presentation, frankly, but nonetheless, very, very wonderful to learn more. So,
Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you so much. And we say goodnight, everybody, and we will see you soon. Take care.